00231. Coming clean. Daniel nervously sat next to the two beds that held Millie and Isaac as they slept through the last of their fever. Mary sat not far away next to another bed with Teresa, and next to them sat Sarah, who was holding Dylan's hand as she watched him. All of them were hooked up to a few different machines that monitored their vitals. As for the location, Daniel called Ezekiel, and he brought them to his medical facility. Theo planned to do it even if she didn't ask, because he was concerned about his siblings, but his mom saved him the trouble of making up an excuse. During the last couple days, Ezekiel's team worked with Richard and Mary as Millie, Isaac, Teresa, and Dylan were going through a genetic change. Once it was determined they were going through the same change Peter and MJ went through, everyone relaxed a little bit, but Mary, Daniel, and Sarah insisted on staying with their kids. Richard, to keep his mind off of things, was more interested in the facility and equipment they used. So he spent the last day working with Tobarama and the others as they checked out all the kids' DNA and compared it with each other, while Jacob and John threw themselves into work at the shop to take their mind off of things too. It took 3 full days for everyone's fever to break, and Millie was the first to wake up only to find Daniel's relieved, yet anger-filled face staring at her. Millie smiled at her as she said in her cutest voice, "Hi, Mommy." Daniel narrowed her eyes as she said, "Don't you dare try to mommy me, little lady." Millie started to tremble her lower lip and the corners of her eyes misted up before Daniel chopped her over the head as she said, "Don't you even start with that act, Missy. Your father might fall for it, but I won't." "Sorry. No, you're not, but you will be. You and Isaac are banned from eating sweets for the rest of the year." Millie couldn't even respond. She was so shocked. But she didn't need to, because Isaac, who also woke up, let out a horrified cry of despair. Then they both cried out, "That's not fair." Daniel glared at both of them, and her voice cracked slightly as she said, "Not fair? Do you have any idea what you two did?" Daniel's eyes filled with tears as she said through a sob, We thought you were going to die." Millie and Isaac shared a look as Daniel buried her face in her hands before they quickly got out of bed and hugged her as they said in regret-filled voices, "We're sorry." Mary and Sarah knew exactly what Daniel was going through and stayed quiet because they would probably be doing the same thing when their own kids woke up. Mary, with her scientific mind, worked differently than Daniel's and Sarah's, and she knew from the data the kids would be fine. Changed for life, but fine. But the mother in her, though, it still worried like crazy about her daughter. While she was lost in thought as she watched Daniel with her kids, Teresa hugged her and said in a quiet voice, "I'm sorry I made you worry, Mama." As that happened, Dylan also woke up and started crying as he said, "I'm sorry, Mom. I'll never do something like this again." About half an hour later, once the mothers calmed down and collected themselves, they informed the rest of the family, and they were quickly brought over. After a clean bill of health, well, besides now being part spider, the kids were released. It was Saturday morning when Ezekiel portaled them all home, and then the family gathered together at May's house since that tended to be the default location whenever they did something as a group. Millie, Isaac, Teresa, and Dylan still looked properly chastised when the family gathered together, and Theo was happy to see it. Sure, if they were going to die, Theo would have transferred them to temporary bodies while he cloned them new bodies. But to put their parents through all of that, and the worst part was he could have prevented it if he was just paying attention and wasn't worried about his secrets being revealed. Over the last few days, as his parents, especially his mom, worried about Millie and Isaac, Theo thought long and hard about whether he should just come clean about his identity to his family. It was something he planned to do sooner or later, but it was always planned for later and not when he was getting ready to enter high school. Like after he moved out, had his own place, and maybe saved the world once or twice. As he sat in the living room crammed with everyone he considered family, he finally came to his decision. The moms were grouped together on one side, still holding their kids close, while Jacob and the other dads were quietly talking together as they shared a beer. Since Peter wasn't part of the idiot group, and neither was Theo, they were sitting off to the side drinking soda. For a while, Theo just enjoyed the quiet atmosphere until he stood up and nervously said, "Since the whole family is here, I'd like to say something." As everyone turned to look at Theo, he took a deep, calming breath before he said, "I'm also a metahuman." "I knew it, you liar," Millie yelled as she pointed at Theo. Daniel pulled Millie's hand down as she said, "Don't yell and don't call your brother a liar. But he said he didn't have powers when I told him to show me." Daniel nodded before she said, I'm sure he had his reasons. But he's telling us now, so that's all that matters. Everyone focused on Theo as he tried to figure out what to tell everyone. Sure, the powers part, but what about Ezekiel? Vibe? Genosha? What about the secret organization he was running? Or the ninjas living in his head, or even his old life? Theo froze as he realized he wasn't sure how much of the truth he wanted to tell. The simple thing would be to just tell them everything, but then he would need to lock down their minds with protection so other people couldn't find out. But would they agree to something like that? He wouldn't be able to do something like that himself, though, so he would need to bring in Tao to help with it. As Theo was lost in his thoughts, Daniel approached and pulled him into a hug as she said, If you don't want to tell us now, it's okay. Just do it whenever you're ready. Theo hugged Daniel back as he said, Thanks, Mom. After they separated, Theo took a breath and made a shadow clone. Everyone stared at both Theos for a few moments before Millie excitedly asked, Why are there two of you? Is that your power? It's one of my powers. This is a clone I use whenever I need to do something and don't want you to realize I'm missing. Daniel frowned as she asked, Why would you need to go missing, and what do you do during that time? Quite a lot, actually. But let me explain my clone for a moment. Theo said as he patted it on the back and said, Whenever I make a clone, it's a copy of me and my memories. When it disappears, I receive whatever new memories it makes. So as long as your clone was there, it was just like you were there? Richard asked as he studied Theo's shadow clone. Theo nodded before a puff of smoke appeared, and a moment later, he was now Ezekiel. He glanced around the room before he settled on his mom and said, This is why I use my clone as a replacement. The entire room went completely quiet as everyone stared at Theo with wide eyes. Daniel was the first to recover as she asked, So that familiar feeling I always had around you was because you're Theo? Ezekiel nodded as he said, It's part of the reason I go by Ezekiel. A mistake on my part using my real middle name for a fake identity. But everyone already knows me by it, so it's too late to change it now. Theo canceled the hinge in his clone as he said, I have a lot more to tell you and show you. But we should probably do it somewhere else and with some food. I'm sure everyone is hungry, and this will take a while. May glanced around the house as she asked, What's wrong with doing it here? Theo pulled out his real phone as he said, I'd rather do it someplace more secure. Theo sent a quick text before he put it away and opened a portal as he said, I'm going to take you to meet some friends of mine. I always thought those portals looked familiar. You studied magic? Jonathan asked as he stood up before he quickly added, Wait, are your eyes red? Theo nodded as he removed the Jinjutsu that blocked his eyes, and his 3-tomo Sharingan slowly spun as he glanced over everyone for a moment before Daniel asked, What happened to your eyes? Theo gestured towards the portal as he said, I'll explain everything soon, but first let's go meet some friends of mine. They stepped through the portal and ended up in a really nice lobby area with a single elevator and 3 doors placed in even distance from it. As they headed towards one of the doors, John moved closer to Theo as he said, To think I found you so quickly and never even knew. It really is a small world. Theo didn't answer as another voice said, It's a small world indeed, Mr. Pangborn. John looked towards the voice and instantly bowed as he said, Ancient One. Tao stood in the doorway in front of them with a smile on her face as she said, None of that now, Mr. Pangborn. But it's good to see you again. John smiled as he pulled Sarah and Dylan close as he said, You two masked. Ancient One, I'd like you to meet my wife, Sarah, and my son, Dylan. Tao nodded to both as she said, It's a pleasure to meet you. Jonathan is a lucky man to have you both. But I believe you are here because Theo has a story to tell you all. We can catch up later since I am sure your wife now has many questions to ask you. John rubbed the back of his head slightly as Sarah elbowed him in the ribs as she studied the teenage-looking Tao with her vibrant red hair tied up in a bun. As everyone else was studying Tao, she smiled at them as she said, Please come inside. A friend just left to go get us food. The inside of Tao's home was a mix of modern and ancient, with a lot of art and relics tastefully displayed throughout. But she also had a massive TV, stereo, an L-shaped couch, and more modern luxuries spread around the room. She led everyone towards the dining room and to a massive table that easily fit everyone with room to spare. Tao didn't normally have the table this size, but used magic to make it bigger for the occasion. As they were sitting around the table, Theo said, Once everyone is here, I'll explain everything. Daniel, who was the closest to Theo, held his hand and gave it a squeeze as she said, "We're in no rush, sweetie. Just take your time." Tao took a seat near John and his wife and quietly talked with them as everyone else either talked with each other or glanced around the room. About 10 minutes later, the door opened, and in walked Agatha, followed by Hella, who quickly moved towards Theo before she took up the empty seat beside him and scooted it a little closer to him. As she did that, Daniel studied the woman who was clearly a lot older than her 13-year-old son before she asked, "Theo, who exactly is this lady?" Theo glanced towards his mom and saw the look on her face before he swallowed and said, "Mom, this is a close friend of mine. Her name is Hella." Theo glanced towards Hella, who was looking at him with concern in her eyes before he said, "Hella, this is my mom, Daniel Mercer." Hella turned towards Daniel and put on a beaming smile as she said, "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Mercer. Theo has told me a lot about you." As Agatha was busy setting out pizza and drinks for everyone, Daniel stayed focused on Hella as she said, "Strange, he's never mentioned you before. Then again, I didn't know he had a secret identity either. I'm sure Theo will explain more about me soon enough. But for now, I'll give you my full name and title as it's only proper." Hella said before she sat up straighter and took on a more regal air in her Gundam t-shirt and pajama pants and said, "I am Hella, Odin's daughter, the former commander of the legions of Asgard, the rightful heir to the throne of Asgard by birthright, and the goddess of death." As she finished speaking, everyone in the room was now staring at her besides Tao, Agatha, and Theo, who just shook his head slightly. Daniel quickly recovered as she asked, "I'm not sure what all that means, but it sure sounds impressive. But what do you mean by goddess of death?" Theo quickly replied as he said, "She is a god, but only with the G capitalized. Not like a god with all the letters capitalized." "And the difference is?" Jacob asked as he studied Hella. "That would take a really long time to explain properly, but I guess we could get into it too since I'll be talking about God a bit." Theo glanced around the room for a few moments before he said, "Well, no time like the present, I guess." 00232. Evolving situations. Coming clean to his family was a pretty long process for Theo, and he had to answer way too many questions. It took almost 10 hours to finish, and he still didn't go over everything. Just the main things they needed to know and any questions they wanted answered. By the end of it, everyone was worn out, and Theo helped send everyone else home, but with all of them agreeing to meet up again the next day because they still had stuff they wanted to talk about. Theo was nervous as he sat across from Daniel and Jacob, who talked with each other for almost an hour before they came to his room and asked to talk with him after midnight. Theo's chest tightened as one of the scenarios he dreaded seemed to be playing out. It was one of the reasons he never wanted to reveal anything to his parents and kept putting it off. Daniel nervously smiled at him as she said, "We learned a lot today. A lot more than we probably needed to know or wanted to know for that matter." Daniel shared a look with Jacob for a few moments before she focused on Theo as she said, "It's a little weird knowing you're actually older than both of us." "Actually, it's extremely weird." Jacob slowly nodded before he added, "And the fact you're incredibly powerful." Daniel paused and took a calming breath before she said, "And the security measures you've put in place to help protect us." Jacob nodded in agreement before he gently held Daniel's hand as he added, "It's honestly hard to come to terms with what you've told us about." Theo's heart was beating like a drum as his mom said, "We both really need time to properly process everything. But we've come to a decision about you and us going forward." The us part made Theo's heart tighten in his chest like it was clamped in a vice as Daniel shared a glance with Jacob again, who nodded before she turned towards Theo and said, "But we want you to know, no matter what, you're still our son." Jacob nodded as he added, "No matter what happened before you arrived here, you're still the same son we created and raised since you were born, and that will never change." The tightness in Theo's chest disappeared, and relief flooded his body as his eyes misted up before tears started to freely fall down his face. Daniel and Jacob instantly moved towards him and pulled him into a tight hug as he cried and hugged them back. The fear of being rejected by his family for revealing the truth had plagued the unconscious thoughts of his mind for far too long. With the truth now revealed and his parents still accepting who and what he was, it was like a mountain was lifted off of him. Theo cried freely as he embraced his parents, and as he did, blood started to run down his face as his eyes slowly changed. Something Theo never even realized that was hidden inside his mind was finally gone, and as Theo's love for his parents filled his heart, it also released the only thing that kept his eyes from evolving. The three of them sat there until Theo finally calmed down and said in a relieved tone, "Sorry for not telling you sooner. I was just afraid of what could have happened if you learned the truth." Daniel pulled back slightly to look at Theo, whose face was lowered as she said, "We would never do that, sweetie. You're our son before anything else." Theo pulled back, and as he looked up at Daniel, she gasped as she said in confusion, "Theo, you're crying blood." Theo frowned as Jacob pulled back to look before he added, "And your eyes changed." Theo turned to look at the mirror they had in the living room to see that his eyes were different. Instead of his three-tomo Sharingan, Theo now had a Mangekyo Sharingan that slowly spun to a stop. Theo studied it for a few moments as he slowly understood what just happened, and he smiled as he pulled his parents into another hug. His parents were slightly concerned, but returned the hug without a second thought. A few minutes later, Theo released his hug as he said, "Sorry. Crying blood is a side effect of my eyes evolving again." Daniel stared at Theo nervously as she asked, "Why did they change again? What happened?" "It was both of you accepting me for who I am and my love for you. I was so afraid of being rejected that it hindered the evolution of my eyes subconsciously," Theo said before a relieved smile filled his face. Daniel kissed his forehead before she pulled back and looked into his eyes as she said, "No matter what, you're our son before anything else. Never forget that." Theo nodded as Jacob slapped the back of his head, which caused both Daniel and Theo to look at him in confusion before he said, "And that was for your first words, you little brat." Daniel froze for a moment before she burst into laughter, and Theo soon joined in, followed by Jacob. When they finally stopped, Daniel shook her head as she asked, "I thought you said you didn't care about that." "I didn't when I thought he was just a baby and didn't understand. But now I know it was intentional," Jacob said as he shot a mock glare at Theo, who smiled back as he said, "Come on, it was comedy gold. You would have done the same thing in my position." Jacob slowly nodded and started to smirk as he said, "Probably." Daniel reached over and grabbed some tissues before she cleaned Theo's face as she said, "Now that we know about everything, we aren't going to interfere or stop you. Not like we really could in the first place." Jacob placed a reassuring hand over Theo's shoulder as he said, "But that doesn't mean you can just stop going to school for now and just do whatever you want." Daniel nodded as she added, "We would like to keep things as they are, but also not be kept in the dark anymore. You don't have to tell us everything you're doing, but we would like to know the real you and not what you've been showing us," Jacob said as he squeezed Theo's shoulder slightly before he added, "Like, what's the deal between you and Hella?" Daniel nodded as she said, "You both seemed really close today, but you barely mentioned anything about her after her introduction." "Huh? Me and Hella, we're just good friends." Daniel shared a look with Jacob before she said, "Just good friends, huh? In that case, you can bring her home sometimes if you like. Even though she seems a little old compared to your current age, which is a little creepy." Theo chuckled as he asked, "I mentioned she was a god. How old do you think she is?" Daniel thought about it for a little while before she said, "Off of looks alone, I thought she was around my age." Jacob nodded as he added, "The whole concept of gods is still over our heads, just like a lot of stuff you talked about today. Well, for Hella's real age, she is over 20,000 years old." Daniel and Jacob's eyes widened as Theo added, "The red-haired lady Tao, she is around 900 years old, and Agatha is just over 17,000 years old." "Really?" they both asked in surprise. Theo nodded as he said, "You can ask them about it yourself if you want some time." Daniel nodded as she said, "It would be nice to meet more of your friends. I'll gladly introduce you to all of them. But only Hella, Tao, Agatha, and Hulk know who I really am," Theo said before he frowned as he added, "And Fury." "Fury." Theo let out a sigh as he said, "A super spy I work with. I wouldn't exactly call him a friend, but he found out my identity because I slipped up. I've fixed the issue with his help, so no one else should ever find out again unless I tell them. But he still found out." Theo said with a helpless shrug, "You don't like him?" "No. It's more like a built-up prejudice from the many different versions I know of him. After talking with him more and coming to an agreement with him, I realized he's not what I thought he was," Theo said before he glanced between his parents and said, "I'll never tell him that personally, though." Jacob smirked a little as he asked, "You sure you're not friends?" Theo shrugged as he said, "We're definitely something." Iron Man started to play from Theo's pocket as he let out a sigh and said, I should probably answer this. He's been messaging me all day and I've ignored him. As Theo pulled his phone out, Daniel asked, Who? Another friend of mine, but he doesn't know my real identity yet, Theo said as he answered the phone on speaker as he asked in Ezekiel's voice, What do you want, Tony? I've been messaging you all day and you never responded. I was with my family and still am. Theo said as Daniel and Jacob shared a glance before Daniel mouthed to Theo, Tony Stark. Theo nodded as he said, And I saw your messages, but nothing was urgent, so I didn't respond. You could have at least responded letting me know you saw them. Tony said in an annoyed tone. Theo rolled his eyes as he said, If I replied, you would have instantly called me like you always do. Pepper laughed before she said, I'm kinda jealous of how Tony acts towards you. It's almost like he treats you more like a girlfriend than I am. I do not. Theo shook his head as he said, As much as I hate to admit it, you're right. Maybe I should block his number so he spends more time with you and Morgan. Don't even think about it. Plus, I spend way more time with Pepper and Morgan than I do with you. That's because I don't come by your house that often. Theo said before he added, Anyways, was there a point to this call, or did you just want to hear the sound of my voice? Fuck off. Language. Pepper and Daniel said at the same time, which caused Jacob and Theo to start laughing. Huh? That didn't sound like hella. Tony said in a confused tone. It's not hella. I said I was with my family. That was my mom. I'm currently with my parents, and you're on speakerphone. Oh, you always talk about them. How about you bring them over so we can finally meet them? Theo glanced at his parents before he asked. Some other time, maybe. So what did you want? Can you come over tomorrow morning and send us to Genosha for the day? Really? You needed to call me for that. Theo asked before Tony said, Not just that. Tony wanted to tell you Morgan said your name today while pointing at your picture. Well, she said Zek instead of Ezekiel. Pepper said in a proud voice. Really? Theo asked before Daniel added, Who's Morgan? Tony and Pepper's daughter. Tony Stark has a kid. Jacob asked as he shared a shocked look with Daniel. Theo chuckled as he said, That's kind of a secret, so don't tell anyone else. We won't. But how could they keep it a secret? Doesn't Tony like to show off? Daniel asked as she frowned slightly. Theo chuckled as he said, I helped keep it a secret, plus Tony and Pepper aren't married yet, so it makes things complicated for the business. The estimated loss in share price is estimated at 10%. Jarvis said before Tony added, and that's only the low end. It could drop even more, so we're holding off on announcing anything. Theo nodded along before he added, In a year or two, once Morgan is older, it will have a much smaller impact. And the medical pods we've been developing should be finished by then, so we'll launch those at the same time to cancel out the bad PR. Tony said before he added, At least that's the current plan with the best estimated results for the share price. That just sounds like a major hassle. I'd rather troubleshoot an intermittent electrical issue on a newer car engine instead, Jacob said as try to understand their thought process. You're telling me I would rather work on an engine all day than deal with any type of business stuff. Tony said before he quickly added, Oh yeah, I forgot Ezekiel said you were into cars. You want to come over and check out my collection? Jacob glanced towards Theo, who shook his head before he said, Not right now, but maybe one day. That's fine. The invitation is always open though. Anyways, about tomorrow. I'll call you in the morning before I come over. Ezekiel said before Tony replied, Great. See you tomorrow then. 00233, Theo's new strength. The second talk with his family was much easier the next day and a lot more relaxed. Theo, with his parents accepting who and what he was, removed a significant burden from his mind and made everything easier. There were still some issues that cropped up, the main one being he wanted to give everyone new bodies to help protect them. But when he brought up the issue, there was pushback since some of them didn't like the idea. It just doesn't seem right. Ben said with a slight frown, What's wrong with giving all of you a better body? One that can help protect you and also make you live longer. May shook her head as she held Ben's hand and said, Because we would no longer be us. I can assure you, Mrs. Parker, the only thing that truly makes you who you are is your soul. The body it rests in doesn't actually matter. Richard frowned as he asked, That doesn't make sense. What about our memories? Isn't that all stored inside our brains? Mary nodded in agreement as she said, From a scientific perspective, half the stuff we've been told about makes absolutely no sense. Mysticism and sorcery tend to not make sense under a scientific microscope, but that's because it follows a different set of laws. Just like metahuman powers can't be fully quantified by science or sorcery. Theo nodded in agreement as he said, I saved a metahuman years ago with ice-based powers that make no sense at all. He can create ice and freeze things at will, with no visible drawback. But that's just his power, right? Why doesn't it make sense? Jacob asked with a frown. Because it completely breaks the first law of thermodynamics. Energy cannot be created or destroyed, only transferred or transformed. Yet when he uses his powers, that doesn't happen at all. Theo said as he shook his head slightly before he added, Sorry, we got off topic. But new bodies for everyone won't change who you are. It will just make you safer. Theo turned towards Jonathan as he said, Like Uncle John who uses magic to walk. With a new body, he'll be able to walk without using magic. Everyone glanced towards Jonathan as Sarah leaned closer to him, and he said, It would be nice to not channel mystic energy, just to walk. Theo nodded before he turned to May and Ben as he said, I know both of you treat us like your own kids, but with new bodies you could easily have children too. Ben's arm over May's shoulder tightened slightly as they shared a glance with each other. Theo waited for a few moments before he added, The other reason I want you to have new bodies is so you can live longer. How much longer? Daniel asked curiously. About 500 years. Or more. 500 years? A few people around the table said at the same time. Daniel focused on Theo as she asked, Is that how long you're going to live for? I'm actually not sure how long I'll live for exactly, but thousands of years isn't out of the question on the low end. But it will probably be a lot longer if I'm being completely honest. Daniel glanced at Hela for a few moments before she asked, So you're like Hela? Some type of god? Theo nodded as he said, Pretty much. And it's partly why I'd like all of you to have new bodies. You could call me selfish, but I'd honestly like all of you to stick around for a good while since you're my family. Richard frowned slightly as he said, But living that long, wouldn't that cause issues? Theo shrugged as he said, I have people working on something that should extend the average person's lifespan by about double. You guys will just have something a little bit better. Mary frowned slightly as she asked, But if what you said earlier about our soul being our true self, couldn't you just transfer our souls whenever our bodies were near the end of their lifespan? I would love to, but the universe has aspects that control certain facets of reality, and one of them is death. Making you live a while longer shouldn't matter, but trying to make you live forever would cause issues. Theo said with a helpless shrug before he added, It's the same reason I'm not trying to make humans live longer than a couple hundred years. When you mess with the natural order of things, really bad things end up happening. The conversation carried on for another hour, but eventually everyone agreed to let Theo create new bodies for them. Millie and the other kids would take the longest since testing would need to be done because of their new DNA. But the plan was to give them bodies that could also use chakra, so it would be easier to train them. The rest of the day was spent with Theo answering questions everyone had. By the end of the day, Theo was mentally exhausted, but overall happy with how things turned out. As far as he could tell, all of his family still treated him about the same. With his family situation taken care of, and Tao helping to lock down their minds with spells. She also helped with an extra spell for Millie and Isaac that stopped them from eating sweets. Theo had brought it up as a joke since he figured Millie and Isaac would sneak sweets when no one was around. But Tao used a compulsion spell that stopped them from being able to eat anything considered sweet. It was incredibly strict and worked perfectly as it locked up their bodies whenever they tried to pick up something sweet. If someone even handed them some type of sweet, the only option was to place it down. As for them trying to get someone else to feed them something sweet, their mouths would lock up and wouldn't open. Theo found it hilarious while Millie and Isaac protested it was unfair. But Daniel didn't care and said, This is the best way to ensure you don't try to skip your punishment. As for how his siblings would last going basically a full year without sweets, Theo wasn't sure, but it promised to be fun. With that out of the way, Theo turned his attention to Jean and how to handle her. Well, her and MJ, since they tended to hang out with his siblings the most. He was pretty sure he knew how she figured out he had powers, and it was mostly likely from his clones, but he still wanted to confirm it. As for what he would tell her and MJ, he would expose his powers, but nothing else since they weren't his family. He would also keep his Ezekiel persona secret since that wasn't relevant information they needed to know. But that would have to wait till after school the following day since Theo wanted to rest. The next day, Theo went to school with everyone else and even stayed the whole day. After school, once everyone was at the shop and finished with their homework, Theo turned to Jean and asked, "How did you figure out I have powers?" Both MJ and Jean turned to look at Theo before Jean asked, "Didn't you deny having powers last week?" Theo shrugged as he said, "After the idiots scared my parents, I decided to tell my family about my powers. And since you and Jean shared yours, I'm doing the same. But I also want to know how you figured it out. I can sense a person's life force, and yours is like a massive beacon compared to other people. But sometimes it disappears like you're not really alive," Jean said with a frown. Theo stood and moved his hand into a pattern before another Theo appeared next to him. He glanced towards Jean afterwards and asked, "Like this?" Jean nodded as she pointed at the new Theo and said, "That one feels like nothing, like it doesn't exist." Theo let out a sigh before he said, "I thought you couldn't sense life force yet, so I didn't account for that issue." Jean's eyes narrowed as she asked, "You know about my powers? Who do you think contacted Tao to teach you?" "Tao?" Jean asked in a confused tone before Theo said, "The Ancient One, or Tao for short. But I suppose you just call her master at this point." MJ, who was busy studying Theo, and his clone finally glanced towards Jean as she asked, "That's the person who is helping you learn how to control your powers?" Jean nodded as she said, "She is the current Sorcerer Supreme of Earth and helps protect it from mystical threats. She's also the best magical teacher you'll find, even if her methods are a little harsh," Theo said with a slight shudder. "Harsh. We mostly read, and she helps me practice controlling my powers. Wait for combat training," Theo said with a slight shake of his head before he added, "We'll probably see each other a bit more going forward since you're training with Tao. I'll ask her about it tonight." Theo nodded before he dispelled his clone and said, "Since I now know how you figured it out, I guess I should tell you both a brief overview of my powers." Theo spent the next hour giving a basic overview of his powers to Jean and MJ. After he was finished, he asked Tao to help protect MJ's mind with a couple barriers. As for Jean, she was already in the process of learning how to do it herself. She didn't want to mess with her mind. Once all of that was settled, Theo finally took time to explore his new eyes. Like all Mangekyo Sharingan, Theo's resembled a pinwheel. The design had 6 points that tapered out from a thin ring near the middle of his eyes and touched another ring with 6 larger points that went out to the edge of his eyes. As for his eyes' powers, Theo sensed that one of them was like a Beidou's Kimui. But when he used it, he didn't appear in some dark black void filled with square black-colored pillars. Instead, it was actually a pocket dimension about 100 miles in size that was fully controlled by Theo. Currently, it was empty and basically a flat circular area, but Theo knew he could bring things into it and turn it into a livable pocket dimension. Once items were brought inside, Theo could move them around at will and basically play God. The dimension also allowed him to set up a day-night cycle, a weather cycle, and other things once he acquired the right competence. As for why he received that power, it was simple to understand. His desire to protect those he cared about manifested him the perfect protection. He was the only person who could access the dimension, and while his eyes were the reason it was created, he instinctively knew that if he lost his eyes, he would still be able to access it, but not use the power like a Beidou did in combat if his eyes were gone. The dimension would also slowly expand in size as he grew in power. As for how big, he had no idea. It seemed like this was some kind of bonus God gave him. As for accessing the dimension, Tao wasn't able to access it even with the help of the Space Stone, but she could portal out once inside of it with the help of the Space Stone. Whether or not a higher-tier entity could access it, Theo didn't know and didn't plan to find out if he could help it. As for his second eye power, it was basically foresight and allowed him to see up to 5 seconds into the future. The downside was it was a massive drain on his eyes and caused them to lose some of his vision after a single use. Kimui, on the other hand, was a lot less draining and could be used about 5 or 6 times before it started to affect his vision. The plus side was his body would heal the damage after an hour or so, and Theo was positive that was his path towards unlocking Eternal Mangekyo Sharingan. It would obviously require more testing, but at least Theo wouldn't need to worry about going blind because of it. Because of that, Theo would use the ability a single time every few hours whenever he was awake to slowly build up his eyes' powers and strength. 00234. Family training arc started. It took 3 months for Theo to get everyone in his family new bodies, including his siblings. Millie and the others took the longest since Theo wanted them to have their spider powers and not have any side effects. With some help from the Time Stone and a few failed clones, Theo and his team were able to make bodies for them. They had less chakra and would never be able to reach past Kage levels. But the goal was to give them more options if they ever decided to fight. Theo didn't plan to encourage any of his siblings into helping fight crime or be heroes. But that didn't mean he wouldn't make sure they couldn't defend themselves. The same thing went for the rest of his family. Once they had new bodies and their chakra stabilized, he brought them to his hidden training room. It was just after dinner on a Friday night, and Theo portaled everyone to his training room. After they arrived, everyone looked around in shock at the sheer size of the place. Theo waited for a minute or so before he gathered everyone's attention and said, "All right, tonight marks the first night of training. I'm going to teach all of you how to properly sense chakra and the basics on how it works." Theo had everyone sit down and talk them through how to sense chakra before he moved on to how to control it. After a couple of hours, he had everyone practicing the leaf-sticking exercise as he helped them with his clones. After a few hours of practice, Theo finally started combat training. As everyone gathered up, Daniel said, "I still don't think learning how to fight is necessary. We will never need to use it with all the protections you have in place." Theo nodded slowly as he said, "You're right. You'll probably never need combat-related skills. But I believe in the proverb, it's better to be a warrior in a garden than a gardener in a war." "You think we are going to be fighting in a war?" May asked in a worried tone. Theo shook his head as he said, "If I can help it, none of you will ever have to defend yourself. But at the same time, if something happened and all my precautions failed, I would rather you have the ability to defend yourself than be vulnerable and helpless." After talking a little more, Theo set everyone up with a clone for help and slowly taught them basic taijutsu forms. He would slowly build everyone up and then start real combat training in earnest. Once they learned to make clones, it would be even faster to train everyone. But for now, Theo trained them every day after dinner for 6 hours. Since everyone had better bodies, they found that 4 hours of sleep was more than enough to be completely rested. With his family taken care of and training underway, Theo turned his attention back to the credit card cabal he destroyed. He already sent people to look into the Hellfire Club and gather information on their members. Most of it needed to be done physically since the club didn't use electronic devices for anything club-related. It was part of the reason Theo hadn't found it sooner. It didn't help that Theo only remembered a handful of members, and they were like ghosts. Sure, he found hints of Emma Frost because Frost International was around, but Emma herself was never there since the company was currently run by her father. As for Emma herself, Theo found traces of her, but she apparently disappeared a couple years ago when she was traveling. No major announcement was made because her father didn't want issues with his company and its stock price. As for the rest of the family, they've sent people to search for her, but with no body and no ransom, they've basically considered her dead at this point. Another member Theo found was Sebastian Shaw of Shaw Industries, but like Emma, the guy was a ghost. The day-to-day running of his company was handled by other people, and he never appeared in public. As for his home and a few other locations, it was like the man never visited them. It was one of the major downsides of Theo's current surveillance system. The world didn't have enough cell phones or cameras linked to the internet that he could access. Large swaths of the world were giant voids he couldn't access unless people went there personally to search. Besides parts of the United States, Japan, South Korea, England, and a few other places, Theo was basically blind for now. Those same blind spots were also what helped people like Sebastian Shaw and other members of the Hellfire Club remain currently hidden. Whether they knew someone was searching for them or not, Theo had no idea, but they were extremely cautious. The couple members he caught were basically pawns for the organization and didn't know who they actually served under. They also received their orders from regular mail that was encrypted and hidden with invisible ink in normal-looking letters. Theo was honestly surprised with how much effort they put in. It almost made Hydra seem lazy in comparison. Then again, Hydra was massive compared to what the Hellfire Club's size should be. But until he found a higher-ranked member, Theo was content to let them be for now, since he knew it was only a matter of time before he found them. Theo also started working on creating a banking platform to go along with his credit card company. It wasn't really needed, but he realized that having a personal bank set up would do a lot of good like the credit card company. It was online only at this point, but Theo planned to open branches to make it more accessible and create jobs. He could also reduce all the rates for everything since he didn't need to operate it at a profit. As long as the bank broke even and paid for itself and the employees, that was all that mattered. Theo knew it would cause another massive issue like everything else he did, but it would be worth it. That wasn't the only new project he started, though. Theo also bought a prison. It was only one for now, but Theo planned to slowly buy every prison he could. The corporate-owned prison system in America was terrible and didn't really help inmates much, so Theo wanted to change it. While not all prisons were privately owned companies, the ones that were operated for profit. And what made them profitable was being full of inmates, which was terrible for inmate reform. Theo already looked into the privately owned prisons and found the recidivism rate for them was almost always higher than government-owned prisons. The prison he purchased was actually owned by another company, but they did a lot of shady things. So Theo made them an offer they couldn't refuse and purchased the company itself for almost nothing from the shareholders. As for some of the people who used to own it, Theo added them to the prison population for their crimes. Sure, he didn't go through the normal justice system, but Theo and his people could read a person's mind and figure out if they were guilty. Needless to say, a handful of them weren't good people, and they didn't last long in prison. Once Theo owned the prison, he started with the warden and worked his way down to make sure no one was corrupt. He found a few people who helped smuggle items in and a few people who liked to abuse their power. But the majority were just there because it was a decent job that paid well. After the guards, Theo slowly started going through the inmates to find out what their real crimes were and if they were actually guilty. Surprisingly enough, he ended up finding a few people that were innocent of the crimes they were convicted for. One person was sentenced for murder, and even after appealing, he was still in prison. After finding out about his situation in more detail, and the fact the man didn't have any closer family, he gave him a choice. Theo would either get him out through legal means and clear his name, but it would take a little while. Or he could help the man disappear with a new identity and a decent amount of money, so he wouldn't need to work. The guy already spent 20+ years in prison, so Theo wanted to give the guy a decent life, which he easily accepted. Another person he found was innocent of the crime he was convicted for, but was guilty for killing other people and a few other crimes. Theo took that man and used hypnosis to have him confess to his crimes of murder, so the victims' families had some semblance of peace. Afterwards, that man decided to take his own life from guilt. The last person he found that wasn't guilty was a man who pleaded guilty to cover up for someone else in the mob. The man was no saint and killed other people, so Theo used hypnosis again so he would confess to his other crimes. After that man also committed suicide, Theo found the real person he covered for and systematically took out the entire family they were a part of while he kept working on the prison. Once Theo had a clear picture of who was really guilty, he gathered up all the murders, rapists, and child predators into one cell block, which ended up having an uncontrollable riot. Unfortunately, a few prisoners went completely psycho, and by the end of the riot, everyone in that cell block perished from fighting and a fire that broke out. While the media did get a hold of the story, it didn't blow up because no one really cared about criminals. Within weeks, the story disappeared, and with the prison basically cleaned out, Theo immediately started retrofitting the prison with decent-sized single cells for each person. Better food along with more activities for everyone to do. While they were still prisoners, they were treated more like humans than anything else. The prisoners were also given classes to help those without a basic education. They were also given proper help to turn them into productive members of society. Some of it was career help or even job training. Some of it was just helping them adjust to what living outside of prison would be like. For the prison itself, it was divided into 4 sections, with new arrivals being in Block 1. Block 2 was for people that passed inspections and were determined to be redeemable by the team. People found irredeemably were kept in Block 1 before they unfortunately passed away from different circumstances. Block 2 was where the process started and where people were helped the most. They normally stayed there until they met the requirements for Block 3, which was mostly for job training. Once they finished there, they were placed in Block 4, which was the largest block and the one with the most freedom. The people in Block 4 were still doing job training, or in some cases working real jobs, and being paid normal wages. They were also given the most freedom because it helped them adapt to what normal society would be like faster. They were also allowed personal entertainment like TVs and game consoles. With all the previous help Theo's team provided, there were no incidents in Block 4. Sure, some people still disliked each other, but it never erupted into violence. Besides normal career training, Theo found some of the most outgoing and charismatic people in the prison for special training. He wanted to help other people in other prisons and knew it would take a while, so he wanted a head start on the project. While hypnosis, mind reading, and other skills Theo and his team processed helped a lot. Theo found most prisoners responded better taking advice and help from other prisoners. So he implemented having Block 4 prisoners helping out in Blocks 1 and 2. The prisoners he selected were given a lot of special training, and Theo also helped them become minor internet celebrities. The goal was to have them travel around the country once they were released and visit other prisons to help out prisoners. Sure, it wouldn't be as good as Theo's prison, but it was a start and would give the people who wanted a chance at a proper life a better shot at one. By the time Theo was finished with the first prison, school let out for the summer. 00235. Summer vacation with? Just before summer arrived for Theo and his family, everyone gathered together to decide what to do. Since Theo and Jonathan had the ability to portal them anywhere they wanted, they didn't need to plan a trip like normal. So as they gathered at May's house, Daniel said, "I think we should plan for day trips. But isn't half the fun staying somewhere new and eating at new places?" Richard asked. Jacob nodded in agreement as he said, "Driving to the destination is also part of the fun." Daniel pinched Jacob's arm as she said, "You just love driving. That's why we never fly anywhere." Jacob smiled slightly and put his arm over Daniel's shoulder as he said, "And what's wrong with that? Flying just isn't the same. Plus, we always find interesting places to visit along the way that we would never find otherwise." Ben nodded along as he said, "That car museum last summer was a great stop." May slapped Ben's arm playfully as she said, "That's because you're a gearhead. But you're both right. All the small stops we've found over the years have always been fun. It would be a shame if we missed out on them." That's true, but with the ability to portal anywhere, our options are limitless. Theo said before he added, "We can visit any country we want each day and sleep at home each night." A few others nodded along before Daniel asked, "Wouldn't we need passports for everyone?" "Technically we would if we traveled normally. But as long as we don't cause issues, no one will bat an eye. I do it all the time and never had an issue," Theo said with a slight shrug and a smile. Daniel frowned slightly before Jacob pulled her closer and said, "I like it. We could even travel more since we wouldn't need to shut down the shop. Just imagine, every weekend we could travel somewhere new. I want to visit Paris," Millie said excitedly as Isaac nodded in agreement. "Paris, France? Do you two want to see the Eiffel Tower?" Millie shook her head as she said, "They're known for making some of the best pastries in the world. I want to visit bakeries there." "You still have over 6 months until you can eat sweets again," Daniel said with a slight frown. 6 months, 12 days, 10 hours and 21 minutes. Millie said with complete confidence as she looked at the clock on the wall. Everyone in the room shared a glance before Theo burst into laughter and said, "I don't know if I should be impressed or concerned." Millie stuck out her tongue at Theo before Daniel said, "Don't do that, Millie. That's rude. And the point still stands. You won't be able to eat anything if we go there." "I know, but I can still look and plan out what to eat next time we go." Theo rolled his eyes before he said, "Well, besides Paris, anyone else have some ideas? I wouldn't mind visiting some other places in Europe with everyone. A lot of the old churches there are incredible to see up close." Daniel quickly nodded along as she said, "We could even make it a tour of historic places around Europe. Why focus on Europe? We could travel to Asia and Africa too. Or Antarctica," Richard said excitedly before Mary said, "Summer for us would mean it's winter there. It would also be extremely cold and basically dark the entire time." "I forgot about that. But we could definitely visit after September when the sun would be out," Richard said before he smiled at Mary. "I could take everyone to visit Mars, but there's honestly nothing to really do there yet. But I could take you up on a spaceship and fly you around," Theo said after thinking for a few moments. Almost everyone looked at Theo in surprise before Theo rubbed the back of his head as he said, "I did mention I was terraforming Mars, right?" Mary and Richard were the only ones who really understood what that meant and stood as they asked at the same time, "You're terraforming Mars?" "Yeah, it was the easiest planet to start with and is our test bed for terraforming techniques. We want to work out the kinks before we try something harder. All I heard was flying in a spaceship. What about you?" Jacob asked as he looked at Ben, who nodded. Richard and Mary were more excited about Mars as they asked, How far have you gotten on the project? With the use of magic and metahuman powers, we already have a place set up for habitation. As for the overall project completion, it's about 20%, and we're still in the process of heating up the planet with greenhouse gases. How? We haven't heard anything about it, and something like that should be visible by telescopes, Richard said in confusion as Mary nodded slowly in agreement as she was lost in thought. We've used a combination of technology and magic to hide it from the world, since I doubt most governments would be happy. Richard nodded before he said, would you share the data you collected so far? I would love to look it over. Yeah, I'll send it to you later. But let's get back to vacation plans. The discussion with his family took over an hour, but everyone agreed to use portals for the upcoming summer vacation. They would all take the next few days to figure out where they wanted to go and then plan the trips from there. When everyone gathered back together, each person had at least one place they wanted to visit, and a list was made for the trip. For the trips themselves, Theo used clones and did a bit of research about the area around each place they were visiting. That way, instead of just going to see the Great Pyramids in Giza, they would also explore a couple of the museums and visit the ancient capital of Egypt, Memphis. Or on their trip to Italy to visit the Roman Colosseum, they also planned to visit all the landmarks around it. The first trip was planned for London with the goal of sightseeing around the city and visiting at least one museum. In the early morning, as everyone gathered at May's, a portal opened up in the living and out stepped Hella in jeans and an anime t-shirt. Theo caught sight of her the moment she arrived and asked, Hella, what are you doing here? Daniel patted Theo on the shoulder as she said, I invited her to join us. Okay, wait, how did you even contact her? Hella approached with a hint of a smile on her face as she said, she asked for my contact information after the first time we met. Daniel nodded as she said, we've kept in contact ever since. Theo glanced between his mom and Hella, who greeted each other before Daniel said, since everyone is finally here, we should get going. Not yet. Everyone needs to change their appearance before we leave. Theo said as he pulled out a handful of seals. Why do we need to use the transformation jutsu? Because being cautious matters. I'd rather just disguise ourselves and not worry about any kind of issues that pop up if we don't. Theo said as he started to hand over the seals to everyone. Jacob held up his phone as he said, but if we change appearance, all of the pictures we take will look weird. I already took that into account, and the new phones I gave everyone have the ability to see through the standard hinge we'll be using. So any pictures you take will be us instead of our disguises. That said, you won't be able to post them online. As people started to change their appearance with the seals, Jacob snapped a couple photos to check out how it worked before he asked, why can't we post them online? Daniel pinched Jacob's arm as she said, for the same reason we will be in disguises. Theo doesn't want to draw any attention to us. Theo nodded as he said, I've gone through a lot of effort to basically make us seem like a middle-class family who runs a small business. Mom, Richard and Mary are the only standouts, and I've used Vibe and my other companies to shield them as just employees. It's why I stand out so much as Ezekiel to draw attention away from my employees. All right, I get it. I won't post anything to Vibe, Jacob said before he used a seal on himself. After he handed seals out to his family and used one on himself, Theo pulled out an extra one and handed it to Hella as he said, I know you don't need it, Dash. Hella cut him off as she took the seal and asked, it's fine, but how do I use it? Since you don't have Chakra, I'll have to inject some into the seal after you put it on. When I do that, just think about how you want to look and the seal will do the rest. Hella nodded before she placed the seal on her forearm before she held it out for Theo. Theo placed a couple fingers gently on the seal before he said, concentrate on how you want to look and I'll inject Chakra in 3, 2, 1. A puff of smoke formed around Hella, and after a moment a teenage version of Hella appeared in the same clothes, but her long hair was now gone. In its place was something very similar to Yoruchi's short hairstyle from Bleach when she was younger and still captain of the 2nd Division. Theo stared at the younger version of Hella dazed for a moment before his mom said with a smile, looks like we're all ready to go. Theo snapped out of his daze and quickly looked away as he said, all right, I'll make a portal now. Since they were visiting London, Theo made a portal to the London Sanctum for their starting point. After everyone stepped out of the portal, Theo greeted the Sanctum Master before they headed out on their adventure for the day. Once outside, the group headed towards Big Ben, and as they walked, Hella stuck close to Theo. At first, everyone was just looking around as they took in the new sights, but within a few minutes, everyone was chatting. Their first stop wasn't far away, and they quickly reached it within 10 minutes. They didn't actually go right next to Big Ben at first, but a popular tourist destination close by to take pictures. Jacob was happily taking photos of everyone before he said, "Hella, come over here and join us for a picture." "Are you sure? This is supposed to be your family vacation." Daniel waved Hella over as she said, "It'll be fine. Come stand next to Theo." After Hella approached, Ben took over picture duty so Jacob could join the family photo. As they stood there, Daniel nudged Theo as she said, "Get a little closer to Hella. Don't stand so far apart." Theo glanced at his mother, who smiled back at him as she mentioned him closer to Hella. Once they were shoulder to shoulder, Hella tentatively placed her arm around Theo's waist and pulled him just a tiny bit closer as Ben said, "All right, smile everyone." After taking a few photos of their family, Ben shared them with Jacob, who chuckled as he said, "Hey honey, look at this." Daniel looked at the photos before she laughed as she glanced towards Theo and Hella. Theo frowned slightly, and before he could ask what was so funny, Jacob showed him one of the photos on his phone. It was focused on Hella and Theo, who both looked incredibly awkward as they stood next to each other blushing. The height difference between them just made everything funnier since Hella was a good foot taller than Theo, standing at 6'3". Hella also saw the picture and stared at it for a few moments before she said, "Send that to me." After everyone took pictures, they headed over to the tower itself, and as they walked, Hella reached over and took Theo's hand. Theo glanced at Hella as she did it, but she completely ignored his gaze as she gently locked her fingers with his and kept walking like nothing happened. Theo's hand quickly started to sweat, and it only got worse when his mom caught his eye and smiled. While he wouldn't say he disliked what seemed to be happening, Theo really wanted to be anywhere else but where he was right now. 00236, a recruitment drive in the desert. During the summer, Theo and his family along with Hella visited a ton of historical places around the world. Theo even took his family to visit Mars, and after some basic instructions let anyone who wanted to fly a spaceship with a co-pilot. Jacob, Ben, Jonathan, Sarah, and Richard ended up having a lot of fun, but Jacob insisted he still preferred driving and racing cars more. Just before his freshman year of high school started, Theo ended up going to Afghanistan to recruit another person who was stationed there. Well, possibly two people depending on if they accepted or not. One was Frank Castle and the other was his best friend Billy Russo, who were both currently serving in the USMC as part of a force recon unit. Ezekiel stepped out of a portal into an abandoned building in the middle of an active war zone. The sound of fighting was all over the place, and the sound of gunfire filled the air. As Ezekiel stepped out of the partly collapsed building, he heard the very distinctive thump of a mortar before the sound of an AGL followed behind it. A few moments later, explosions rang out as dust and debris filled the air all around him. Ezekiel quickly disappeared from the area and reappeared on top of the tallest standing structure around. He took a few moments to find the battle line between the two forces before he headed for the American side. Ezekiel appeared behind some soldiers laying down cover fire behind a low wall, and as one of them stopped to reload, he called out, "Does anyone know where Sergeant Castle is?" One of the soldiers turned around to find Ezekiel calmly standing up behind them. He wore a pair of khakis, a buttoned-up long-sleeve shirt with a checkered blue and white pattern covered by a bulletproof vest. His black hair was cut short while a pair of mirrored aviators rested on his nose. The soldier stared at the man who looked exactly like a typical scene, a spook before a grenade flew over his head, and his eyes widened in shock as he instantly yelled, "Grenade!" Before the other members could even move, Ezekiel casually caught the grenade and instantly tossed it back towards the man who originally threw it. The rest of the soldiers turned around a moment later as the grenade went off and blew even more dust over the area. Ezekiel glanced back at the first soldier as he asked, "So do you know where Sergeant Castle is?" The man quickly shook his head, but another member of his fire team pointed in a direction as he said, "The sergeant should be in that direction with the LT. Just look for a house surrounded by sandbag dash." Another thump from a mortar going off cut the man off before he added, "Or head towards the mortar fire." Another grenade flew over their heads, and they all watched as if in slow motion. Ezekiel caught the grenade and sent it back before he said, "You guys should find some better cover." It looked like Ezekiel reached behind his back and pulled out a few grenades before he quickly tossed them towards a couple broken-down houses. Moments later, massive explosions destroyed the buildings from the exploding tags tied to Kanai Ezekiel threw. As dust and debris filled the air, Ezekiel yelled out, "Move to better cover while the enemy is distracted." The soldiers paused for a few seconds before they realized the area around them was no longer being shot at. They quickly pulled back slightly to a better position as Ezekiel moved towards the mortar position. Ezekiel flicked past a few other fire teams spread out, acting as defensive line to prevent flanking. Within moments, he arrived at what used to be a house, but now looked like a fortified bunker. Next to the bunker was another heavily fortified area surrounded by a blast wall 12 feet in height. Inside that area were three 120mm mortars that were taking turns firing rounds. Ezekiel passed by them and appeared at the door leading into the bunker. Inside, he found controlled chaos. The main radio operator was busy calling in an air strike ahead of their position as a frowning man looked over a map on the table, and a handful of other people were trying to coordinate the squad leaders in the area. Ezekiel glanced around, and when he didn't see Castle, he stepped close to the table as he asked, "I'm looking for Sergeant Castle." The man at the table glanced up about to say something, but when he noticed how Ezekiel was dressed, he paused for a moment before he said, "I have no idea how you got here, but if you're here for Castle, you'll have to wait." The man pointed at the map as he said, "You're here." The man moved his finger to a different area as he said, "Castle and his spotter should be set up around this area, along with a squad that's protecting them." The man then moved to the area in between the two spots as he said, "And this area is currently crawling with hostiles." Ezekiel nodded as he said, "Thanks for the information. I'll go find him." "You can't just dash," the man started to say before he glanced up and Ezekiel was gone. The man frowned before he reached over and picked up a radio. He switched to a different frequency before he said, Fox 1, this is Alpha 1, do you copy?" A voice replied after a few moments, "This is Fox 1, go ahead Alpha 1, over." Fox 1, a CIA spook, just came by looking for Sergeant Castle. Be advised they might be coming towards your location, over. Alpha 1, we will be on the lookout, over. Fox 1, roger. Alpha 1 out. As soon as the man placed down the radio, Ezekiel said, "I'm looking for Sergeant Castle. Can you tell me where he is?" The man whipped around to find Ezekiel, who smiled at the man before he glanced around the abandoned house they were in. The man took a moment to study Ezekiel before he pointed towards the stairs and said, "He's on the 3rd floor in one of the bedrooms." "All right, thanks for the help," Ezekiel said before he headed towards the stairs. The man glanced at the radio for a moment and debated whether to call, and the spook arrived. After a moment, he decided to forget it and went back to monitoring the radio instead. Ezekiel encountered a few other soldiers along the way, who stared at him in confusion as he calmly walked by. On the 3rd floor, he heard someone as they said, "Street 3, the collapsed building, 210 yards dash." "Got it," a gruff voice replied before a shot rang out, and the same voice said, "Target down." Ezekiel walked into a basically empty room and found 2 people laying on the floor. In front of them, about 5 feet away, was a hole maybe a foot wide in the wall. As the man with a spotting scope called out another target, the sniper quickly took another shot and pulled back the bolt of his rifle to reload as he said, "Target down." Ezekiel quietly watched the 2 work like a well-oiled machine for a few minutes before someone took a shot at them. It completely missed and hit the outside wall, but as a few more shots slammed into the building, the spotter said, "Let's reposition again." The sniper grunted in response, and as the both started to get up, they noticed Ezekiel quietly watching them. The sniper smoothly chambered another round and whipped his gun towards Ezekiel as he asked, "Who the fuck are you?" "Someone with a job offer for you, Sergeant Castle." Frank frowned before he lowered his weapon and quickly started to grab his ammo pouches as he said, "If you didn't notice, I'm busy at the moment." Ezekiel nodded as he asked, "Oh, I noticed. Should I take care of this mess so we can talk?" Frank laughed for a moment. It was rough and not filled with mirth at all before he said, "Sure. And get me some beer and a pizza while you're at it." "I don't carry beer, but this should work," Ezekiel said before an ice chest and a couple pizza boxes appeared in his hands before he placed them in front of Frank and the stunned spotter. Ezekiel waved at them before he said, "You guys can go eat. I'll be back in a bit." Frank glanced down at the ice chest and pizza boxes for a moment before he noticed Ezekiel was already gone. His spotter also glanced at the stuff Ezekiel left before gunfire on the side of the building made them move. They left the ice chest and pizza boxes alone, more concerned about getting to a new spot to snipe from. A couple minutes later, when they were set up, the spotter called out, "At the gas station." "What the fuck?" Frank adjusted slightly and found what caught his spotter's attention. They could both see Ezekiel, over 300 yards away, standing in the middle of a blow-up gas station building. On the ground around him were a bunch of people. Whether they were killed or not, neither man could tell. But a moment later, Ezekiel disappeared from their view, and a moment later, they caught sight of him 50 yards away next to a few more people on the ground. Frank and his spotter watched in stunned silence for a few minutes, while Ezekiel basically teleported around and took out people without effort. Within minutes, the Marines noticed the enemy forces were no longer shooting as much, and by 15 minutes, it was almost completely quiet. The Marines stopped shooting too and cautiously waited as they reorganized and checked on each fire team. Ezekiel calmly reappeared in the new room. Frank and his spotter took over before he said in a disappointed tone, "You guys didn't eat any of the pizza? We had a job to do." Frank said in an annoyed tone before he sat up and asked, "Did you kill all of them?" "Most of them. I kept their leaders alive, though, and dropped them off with your commander. Have time to talk now?" "We can talk after the all dash," Frank started to say before he was cut off as someone said over his squad radio. The LT said to pull back to the fire base, "Pack up your shit and gather downstairs in 5 minutes. We're pulling back. If you want to talk, follow us back to base," Frank said, and he cleared his rifle and slung it over his shoulder. Ezekiel shrugged and went back to the other room to store his pizza and ice chest away before he pulled out his phone and texted an order to someone. He got a reply within moments and quickly put his phone away before he joined Frank and his spotter in another room grabbing their gear. Once they were downstairs, the squad leader had each fire team spread out in a formation and would cover each other as they moved from building to building. Once they arrived back at the base, they found out that the commander had already sent out teams to check the area. It was quickly confirmed that all hostiles in the area were either dead or captured. After they were back, the commander called for Frank to come to the bunker, and Ezekiel followed along. When the commander saw Ezekiel behind Frank, his eyes lit up as he said, "I was hoping you would be with him. Do you need something from me?" The commander walked closer to Ezekiel and stuck his hand out as he said, "I have no idea how you did it, but I wanted to thank you for helping me and my men out. Your timely intervention helped save lives, and I heard from a couple people you even saved them from grenades." Ezekiel shook the man's hand as he said, "I was already in the area, so I decided to lend a hand. Speaking of, do you mind if I borrow Sergeant Castle and Russo for a bit?" "Sure, you can use that room over there if you want, and I'll find Russo for you too," the commander said as he pointed towards a door. Ezekiel nodded and said, "Thanks." Once they were inside the room, Ezekiel pulled back out the pizza boxes and ice chest before he said, "Let's dig in while we wait." Frank glanced at the pizza boxes that clearly read Joe's NYC were number 1 for a reason, before he asked, "How old is that pizza?" Ezekiel opened the box, and that tore a ceiling tag in half as he said, "Maybe a month old, I think. It could be older, I don't mark the boxes." Frank frowned as he saw heat waves radiating off the pizza, and a delicious smell filled the air before he asked, "How the hell is that a month old?" Ezekiel grabbed a slice and said, "I seal them with a special tag that keeps them completely fresh." As Ezekiel happily started to eat his first slice, Frank studied him for a few moments before he asked, "What do you want with me and Billy?" "Eat. We can talk after he gets here," Ezekiel said as he waved towards the pizza. Frank reluctantly gave in and grabbed a slice after Ezekiel started on his second slice. As he took his first bite, the door opened up, and in walked Billy Russo, who paused before he asked, "Where the hell did you get fresh pizza from?" After Billy arrived, Ezekiel let both of them eat before he explained why he came. He basically wanted to recruit both of them to join his PMC company. He laid out all the benefits that came with it along with the pay before he gave them each a card with his phone number. He left them alone in the room to finish their pizza as he came out and handed the commander a couple boxes of pizza before he asked, "I placed a large order for about 100 pizzas. It should be done in an hour or so. You think that will feed all your men, or should I order more?" "You did what?" 00237, a fated meeting? With Frank and Billy still in the middle of a deployment, Theo didn't expect an answer anytime soon, but the seed was definitely planted. Theo had more important things to deal with anyways, like his first day of high school. While originally not everyone would have qualified for Midtown High School, Theo changed some records and made sure Millie, Isaac, MJ, and Jean were accepted. He also added extra security since they were going to be outside of the neighborhood. Unfortunately, Theo slightly regretted his decision as he rode the bus to school with everyone else. Since they were now teenagers and the main cloning project was done, the extra security for his siblings were placed as students and faculty members. One of the main problems was the person in front of him, a blonde-haired boy with more energy than common sense. I don't want to go back to school again. I was already a proper ninja. I even saved the world, Naruto complained as he buried his head in his hands. Hinata, please remind your hubby that this is a mission. He doesn't actually need to do well in school, Theo said as he rolled his eyes. Hinata shyly glanced at Naruto and blushed slightly as she said, "We aren't married yet." A goofy grin played across Naruto's face as he looked away from Hinata while he rubbed the back of his head. Shikamaru watched the interaction before he let out a sigh and said, "Women are troublesome." "Oh, so that's what you think about me, huh?" Shikamaru's eyes widened before he was punched in the arm by Temari while everyone around them laughed, and he said, "What a drag." Choji chuckled slightly as he said, "I don't know why you fight it so much. You clearly like her." "I do like her, but are those really my feelings or what I was made to feel for her?" "Really? This again?" Sasuke said with a huff before he glanced out the window. "Don't tell me you haven't thought about it yourself?" "Sure, God said there was a world we came from. But did they really have free will, or were they controlled by the story like puppets? Was it real or just forced because of the story plot?" Shikamaru asked with a frown before Temari said, "Well, I've always liked you for your intellect and personality." A dark-skinned girl with bright red hair happily leaned against Choji and handed him a bag of chips as she said, "I like how caring Choji is. Here you go, darling." Temari pointed towards the girl as she said, "It would be nice if you got over your existential crisis, so we could be more like Karui and Choji." Karui is only like that because Choji's expansion jutsu works on every part of his body and can also be targeted at a very specific spot, Shikamaru said with an eye roll. Karui's face somehow flushed crimson before she covered it, and Choji let out a nervous chuckle as Naruto excitedly asked, "Choji, can I learn that too?" "Naruto," Hinata said as her face turned the color of a tomato. "Huh? What's wrong?" "We've already messed around with Shadow Dash." Hinata clamped her hand over his mouth, while everyone stared at them with wide eyes before they burst into laughter again. Theo dropped his face into his hands as he said, "I'm so glad my siblings are seated at the front of the bus, and I placed a muffle spell around us." "Huh, why's that?" Theo glanced at Kiba as he said, "Because apparently all your friends are degenerates." "I'm not," Ino said with a frown. "Just because you might be the exception to the rule doesn't make it any less true," Theo said as he rubbed the bridge of his nose before he added with a repressed shudder, "I have a copy of everyone's memories, remember? I know everyone's kinks, even if I wish I didn't." Ino blushed as she looked away from Theo along with everyone else except Naruto, who broke free of Hinata's grip as he excitedly asked, "Who has the weirdest kink?" Theo flashed a predatory grin before he said, "I'll tell you, but I'll also tell everyone about your personal kinks afterwards." "He has more than one?" Gaara asked with a bit of interest. Naruto's head whipped back and forth like an out-of-control fire hose as he waved his arms in front of himself and said, "No, no, no, I don't want to know." "Good. Plus, we don't have any time to dig into any of that crazy shit," Theo said as the school bus came to a stop in front of the school. As they collected their bags and stood, Theo dispelled the muffling shield and said, "All right, I'll see you all in class." A few moments later, Theo stepped off the bus to find Peter and the others waiting for him. Peter waved as he said, "I'm surprised you sat with them instead of us." "Nothing was stopping you from joining us," Theo said with a shrug. Peter glanced towards MJ and Jean, which caused Theo to smirk as he put his arm over Peter's shoulder and whispered, "They both know you like them. Ask one of them out already." Peter shook his head as he whispered back, "I don't want to make either of them upset by doing that. Plus, what if it doesn't work out? It could mess up our friendship." Theo glanced towards Peter in surprise as he said, "That's very mature of you to say." Peter pushed Theo away as he said, Shut up. A few moments later, the group headed into school to start their first official day as high school students. The first day itself was easy. They were given their schedules and followed it to meet each teacher and collect any required books. Lunch was just before noon, and the school day ended at 2, but the school also offered a large amount of clubs and activities. Theo and his group didn't stay for any of them, though, since they wouldn't officially start till next week. The first week was for returning members to get together and meet with the teacher in charge. The first week of school was incredibly relaxed as most of the teachers were taking that time to gauge their students. There were still lessons, but none of them gave out homework, at least for Theo and his group. Around the third week of school, Tony messaged Theo excitedly as he asked him to come by while he was eating lunch at school. Theo reluctantly messaged him back that he would be there soon before he went to make a clone. After Theo went to meet up with Tony as Ezekiel, Theo's clone went back to the cafeteria to finish the day. Most of the school day was boring classes about stuff Theo already knew, and this particular clone would rather do anything besides listen to that. So Theo's clone rested his eyes for the last 2 classes before they met up with Peter to head towards the computer club. There were a handful of other clubs they could have joined, but taking in both his and Peter's love for coding, the computer club made the most sense. It was open every day after school and only had 10 members, since the club's main focus was on programming. During the second week of school, over 60 kids arrived to sign up thinking it was about using computers instead of programming. But when they couldn't pass the basic requirement of knowing a tiny bit of basic coding, almost all of those kids were turned away, but also given a paper with instructions on how to program a basic hello world. They were told to memorize that and come back in a few days. Unfortunately, only 4 people came back and attempted the challenge. While 2 of them failed to create it because of simple mistakes, they were still allowed to join. The test was mostly in place to make sure that kids who were actually interested in programming would join the club. As for the club itself, the teacher in charge first tested everyone's skill level before he grouped them together. Each group was given a task around their skill level to complete. It also included things that would help them learn and grow from each task. That was only for the newer and lesser experienced students, though. For the returning and advanced members like Theo and Peter, they were given larger tasks to complete, like building a basic web page. The teacher would give them a build sheet of what he wanted done and generic assets to use. Then he would give them a week to get it finished before he would sit down with each person to discuss the project. Since it wasn't a class, there were no grades, but the teacher would still critique the design and point out flaws like a client would. With those notes from the teacher, the members would need to fix those issues with the website before they were given another task. For not being an actual class, Theo found it a pretty decent way to teach kids, especially if they wanted to be a freelance programmer. He also didn't really teach any of the members like a normal teacher would. If someone ran into an issue or became stuck, he would talk them through the problem instead of giving the answer. It helped the students to learn how to think through problems themselves, and in turn made them better programmers. As for the club activities today, both Peter and Theo's clone worked on another website project. Theo's clone worked a lot slower than Theo personally would, but thankfully didn't add anything extra to the project or mess it up, like some of his more troublesome clones like to do sometimes. As they finished up for the day, Peter stood first as he said, "I promised Jean and MJ I would meet them near the cheerleading practice field." "Uh-huh," Theo's clone said with a knowing smile before he added, "I'm gonna finish this up and then meet Millie before we come find you guys." Peter blushed slightly as he nodded before he grabbed his backpack and took off. Theo's clone shook his head slightly before he saved his work and headed off to find Millie at her club. Millie's club was luckily close to the football field, which is where Peter went to meet up with Jean and MJ. When he arrived, he found Millie chatting with a couple of other girls next to a small container of cupcakes. "Cupcakes again?" Millie and the other girls turned towards the door as Millie said, "Cupcakes give me more chances to practice frosting." Theo's clone approached closer and found that each cupcake was uniquely designed, so he nodded before he asked, "Ready to go?" Millie picked up the container as she said, "Sure. I'll see you tomorrow." "Bye, Emily," both girls said before they left. After they left the room, Millie asked, "Where's Theo?" "He went to meet with Tony about some project. He'll probably be back for dinner." Millie nodded slightly as they stepped outside before heading towards the football field and the cheerleading practice area. Within a few minutes, they almost reached their destination and found Peter in what seemed to be an altercation. A handful of football players had stopped him before he could reach the main practice field. When they stepped closer, they heard, "We don't care if you think you're friends with them. Stop coming here and stop talking to them." "No, you can't stop me from coming here." "Oh yeah? Follow us. We're gonna go have a little talk," a blonde-haired boy said as he roughly grabbed Peter's shoulder to pull him away. The boy probably thought he could easily drag Peter away since he already had a good foot in height on Peter and a lot larger build. But when he pulled on Peter, Peter didn't move and looked up at the other boy like he was stupid. The boy frowned and tried again, but harder the second time, and still Peter didn't move. The boy's friends didn't notice the issue and instead asked, "What's wrong, Flash? Are we doing this or not?" Before Flash could respond, Theo's clone finally spoke up and said, "Millie, go ahead without us." Flash, who was focused on Peter, noticed the two arrivals and frowned slightly as Theo's clone stepped forward and said, "Come on, Pete. Let's go see what they have to say." "Theo," Peter said as he glanced in his direction. Flash studied the new arrival for a moment and found a black-haired boy who was the same height as him with a playful smirk on his face. While the boy wasn't stocky like him and his friends, something about his completely relaxed posture made him pause. Flash's friends didn't seem to notice though, as one of them said, "Let's go. The others are already waiting." That comment made Theo's clone raise an eyebrow before he nodded at Peter and said, "Come on, let's go have some fun." The way Theo said fun caused Flash to shiver and instantly rethink what they planned to do, but his friends grabbed Theo and easily pulled him towards a currently unused storage room. Peter reluctantly followed along, unsure if it was a good idea. When they reached their destination, they found a few more of Flash's teammates waiting for them. As the door was closed, one of them said, "I thought you said it was just one scrawny kid?" "It was supposed to be, but this other idiot showed up," someone else said before the first person replied. "Whatever, let's make this quick before a teacher or the coach finds us." "It's fine. No one should come over here around this time." Theo's clone nodded along before he glanced at Peter and patted him on the back as he said, "You heard him. Just make sure you don't break anything." Flash's back was covered in a layer of sweat by now, and the way Theo's clone said, "Don't break anything," made him rethink this whole thing. If he didn't have a crush on those girls and noticed the way they always talked with Peter, he would have called this whole thing off by now. But they were already at this point, and it was only two of them against Flash and 7 of his friends. 00238. Theo's clone is a menace. Ezekiel was hanging out at Tony's after Tony showed off his new and improved flying car model. All the issues they ran into last time were fixed, and Tony even added a bunch of safety features. Stuff he didn't think were necessary for a test model, but were added at the insistence of Pepper. With those features added to the car, Pepper and Morgan joined them for the first official test drive. A test drive that took them halfway around the world in only an hour. With a hinge technique used on the others, they stopped in Italy to eat lunch, even though it was dinner time for everyone else in Italy. Afterwards, they returned back to LA and Tony's house within half an hour as Tony tested the car's top speed. As Tony checked over the data from the test drive in the living room, Morgan, who was seated in Pepper's lap, held out her teddy bear to Ezekiel and said, "Zek, make Teddy dance." "Morgan, that isn't how you ask people to do something," Pepper said in a teaching tone. Morgan tilted her head to the side for the moment in thought before her eyes lit up and she asked, "Can you please make Teddy dance, Zek?" "Sure, since you asked so nicely," Ezekiel said as he reached over and accepted her teddy bear. Ezekiel placed the teddy bear face down on the couch as he said, "Since Teddy can't dance normally, we need to first help him out and wake him up with some pokes." Ezekiel poked the teddy bear in a few different places as he said, "All right, the first step is done. Now we just need some proper music to wake up Teddy." Tony glanced over to see what was going on as Ezekiel said, "Jarvis, if you would, please." "Certainly, sir." A few seconds later, a song started playing, "Day-o-wa-yo-wa-yo, day-o-wa-yo-wa-yo, daylight come and me one go." The song played as the teddy bears but started to wiggle around. "Day, me say day, me say day, me say day, me say day, me say day-o-wa-yo-wa-yo, daylight come and me wanna go." By this point, the teddy bear's whole body was wiggling around as Morgan giggled, while Pepper watched on with a faint smile. Tony even stopped what he was doing to watch. since this was the first time he'd ever seen Ezekiel make Morgan's teddy bear dance. As the song carried on, the teddy bear slowly got up and started to wiggle its body around before it started to stretch. Tony frowned slightly at the whole display before he asked, "I thought it was supposed to be dancing? Why does it look like it's stretching?" "Because he's been laying around too long and needs to stretch first," Ezekiel said with a playful smile as Morgan nodded along. "But it's dash." Tony was cut off as Ezekiel winked at him and said, "Everyone knows it's a good idea to stretch before you practice any type of physical activity." Tony rolled his eyes before he continued to watch as the bear finished its stretching and the song slowly faded away. Just before the next song started, the teddy bear back flipped off the couch and landed on the coffee table in a perfect gymnast pose. A moment later, the music started to play as the teddy bear started to dance around. Morgan started to clap excitedly as the song played. "Shake, shake, shake, Sonora, shake your body line." The teddy bear slowly started to float in the air and dance as the song continued. "Shake, shake, shake, Sonora, shake it all the time." "Is he really dash?" Tony asked before Pepper cut him off as she said, "Yes. Work, 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 Sonora, work your body line. Work, 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 Sonora, work it all the time." As Ezekiel was in the middle of reenacting the ending dance scene from Beetlejuice, his clone was in the process of corrupting Peter. Peter glanced at the pile of kids groaning on the floor with a helpless look on his face. He really didn't want to fight, partly because he didn't think it would help anything and might make things worse. The other reason was he knew just how strong he was and didn't want to hurt anyone. But when Flash and his friends went to attack him, his body just moved on instinct from all the combat training Theo put him through. He might have been a little rougher than needed, but 90% of what just happened was all muscle memory. Theo's clone let on a low whistle as he smacked Peter on the back and said, "Nice job, Pete." Peter rubbed the back of his head as he said, "Yeah, but now we might get in trouble." A playful smirk played across the clone's face as he said, "Nope, I didn't fight, only you did." Peter's face paled as he realized what Theo's clone said was right before the door opened and two more of Flash's teammates entered. They paused for only a moment before they both bolted out of the room a second later. Peter's head whipped towards Theo's clone as he asked in concern, "Shouldn't we stop them?" "Up to you, I'm just along for the ride." Peter frowned at the comment before he said, "Let's just leave before they come back." Peter and the clone left the room and headed towards where the cheerleaders practiced. It only took them a minute or so to reach the area, and they found Millie off to the side watching the other girls practice. When Peter and Theo's clone arrived, she glanced at them before she said, "You better not have been fighting, or I'll tell Mom." The clone reached out and rubbed Millie's head as he said, "Look at you fishing for brownie points. Unfortunately, no matter how hard you try, Mom isn't going to lift your restriction anytime soon." Millie clicked her tongue and looked away as Theo's clone chuckled slightly and studied the area. As he glanced around, he noticed the two boys who took off early. They were now on the practice field talking with the other members of the football team. Theo's clone watched them for a few moments before he nudged Peter and subtlety motioned towards them. Peter nodded in understanding, but did nothing as he turned back his focus to Jean and MJ as they practiced with the other girls. Over the next minute or so, Theo's clone watched as the rest of the football team started to move as a group. No teachers were in the area, and as for the football coach, they passed him and another teacher on the way here. Technically, after-school activities were over, and everyone should be cleaning up or leaving. But from the past few weeks of experience, certain clubs and sports activities always stayed later. The football team disappeared towards where Flash and his friends were, and within 5 minutes or so reappeared with them. Everyone Peter beat up was near the front of the group. Well, that wasn't true since Flash was hidden in the middle of the pack. As soon as they reappeared, the group of 40-plus students headed directly towards Peter and his group. As they approached, everyone who was still in the practice field paused to see what was going on. Peter glanced towards Theo's clone as he asked in a worried tone, "This doesn't make sense. Why are all of them coming over here?" The clone's eyes flashed red as he said, "I told you this would be fun." Peter's eyes widened as he finally realized Theo's clone used some type of Ninjutsu on everyone to cause this. The clone patted Peter on the back as he said, "Make sure you take off your shirt." "What? Why would I do that?" "Couple reasons. The first is so it doesn't get ruined in the ensuing fight. Second, It will show off your muscles to all the girls watching. Peter blushed slightly at that comment before he frowned and pushed the clone forward as he said, "No way. You caused this mess, you have to deal with it. But I set this all up so you could show off to MJ and Jean. Plus, if this doesn't impress them, I'm sure other girls will like it," the clone said before he pointed to a different area of the practice field as he added, "Look over there. Besides the cheerleaders, there is also the track team, and I'm pretty sure that's the girls' volleyball team." To his credit, Peter did glance towards all the girls that were currently following the football team's movement before he said in an annoyed tone, "I don't care about that. You caused this mess, now go fix it." Millie nodded in agreement as she added, "Stop trying to get Peter in trouble. It's clear he doesn't want to fight." But he already beat up 8 of them. Millie's head snapped towards Peter as she asked in surprise, "What?" "I didn't mean to. I just defended myself." Theo's clone nodded his head as he said with a smirk, "In for a penny, in for a pound." The football team members were pretty close now, and one of them yelled out, "Hey, you punk. You think you can sucker punch the captain and get away with it?" Peter groaned at how cliché everything was before Theo's clone patted him on the back again and said, "You got this." Peter grabbed the clone by the arm and pushed him forward as he said, "Since you want to show off so much, you go handle it." "No way. I set this up for you. You go handle it." As they broke out into an argument, Millie stepped away and climbed up on the bleachers nearby as she pulled out her cell phone. She recorded as Peter and Theo's clone were surrounded by the football team, while one of the leaders confronted Peter and said, "You like to sucker punch people, huh? Why don't you try that shit on me? Go on, do it, pussy." Peter tried to de-escalate the situation as he said, "I didn't sucker punch anyone. You guys tried to jump me, and I just defended myself." "Bullshit. A little nerd like you would never be able to touch us," the boy said before he swung at Peter, who shifted his head slightly to the side to dodge. The boy swung again, and Peter easily dodged again as he said, "Look, I don't want to fight you guys. Can you please stop? Someone hold him in place so I can punch this nerd." Some of the other members attempted to grab Peter, but he easily evaded their grasps for a few seconds as he glanced towards Theo's clone and asked, "Are you going to help stop this, or what? You look to be doing fine," the clone said just before someone attempted to punch him in the back of the head. As the clone dodged to the side, someone else managed to grab his shirt and tear it slightly before he pointed at it and said, "And this is why I said you should take off your shirt." Peter, who also had his shirt ripped at this point, let out a sigh before he blocked an attack because he didn't have room to dodge anymore. As the other members pressed in closer, Peter could no longer dodge, and neither could Theo's clone, so they finally attacked. Peter's arm connected with someone's stomach first, and as they doubled over, he grabbed their head and smashed it into his rising knee. Theo's clone reacted at the same time as his right hand shot out and clipped someone's jaw. As that person dropped like a puppet with its strings cut, his arm retracted, and he elbow struck someone else in the nose. Within mere moments, 6 people were down, and they had created a tiny bit of space around themselves again. Theo's clone looked down at his ruined shirt before he clicked his tongue, grabbed it by the collar, and ripped it completely off. Since Theo liked to wear slightly baggy, loose-fitting clothes, it seemed like he was tall and skinny to most people. Sure, Theo wasn't overly bulky like the football players around him, but years of consistent training had given him a body absolutely packed with tight, lean muscles. Everyone around him paused for a single moment while they took in his appearance. As Theo's clone rolled his shoulders, a smile played across his face as he asked, "All right, who's next?" Peter, who was next to him, let out a sigh and ripped off his own ruined shirt to expose his own upper body packed with muscles and abs as someone yelled, "Fuck you. Everyone get them." After that person yelled, it was like a switch was flipped and everyone charged towards them. While Peter didn't have the same amount of training as Theo, with his decently trained spider sense and reflexes, he easily danced around anyone who got close. Theo's clone, on the other hand, had years of training and real combat experience under his belt. Compared to Peter, who was like a dancer, Theo's clone was an orchestra conductor as he easily controlled everyone around him. Anything he did was calculated for the best possible outcome. Instead of dodging an incoming punch, he would redirect it towards another person instead. An incoming kick would be pushed aside at just the right time to hit someone else. Within a few minutes, the entire freshman football team was on the ground groaning in pain as Peter and Theo's clone stood above them. Besides the noise the football players were making, The rest of the training field was dead quiet, as everyone stared in complete shock. The silence was finally broken as Millie excitedly said, "I recorded everything. Just wait till I show this to Mom." Theo's clone chuckled and shook his head as he said, "Go ahead. It's not like it's my problem anyways." "I hate you so much right now," Peter mumbled before two concerned voices broke the silence. "Peter." Peter glanced up to see Jean and MJ rushing over while Theo's clone whispered, "Looks like they don't even care about me, and you won't even dare to ask one of them out. How tragic." "Shut up. I really don't like you right now," Peter said in an annoyed tone as they walked through the groaning students. They both meet the girls and Millie, who came down from the bleachers nearby as Jean and MJ stopped to examine Peter. Other girls started to come over as Jean asked, "Are you okay? They didn't hurt you, did they?" MJ nodded in agreement as she asked, "What the hell was that about anyways? Why did they attack you like that?" Theo's clone tossed his arm over Peter's shoulder as he said, "Apparently some of them thought Peter didn't deserve to even talk with either of you girls, and it just escalated from there." Jean narrowed her eyes slightly for a few moments before she frowned and said, "Flash, that idiot who asked us both out the other day? He's the one who started this whole thing." "What? Someone asked both of you out?" Peter asked in concern. MJ nodded before she said, "He asked out Jean first, and after she turned him down, he found me and asked Dash. What the hell is going on here?" Everyone turned to see the football coach storming over along with two other teachers in tow and some students. When they reached closer, one of the football players sat up. His face was bruised, and he had a black eye. He pointed at Peter and the clone as he said with a lisp, "They beat us up." The coach frowned as he glanced over the entire team and the two shirtless students before he asked, "You expect me to believe two kids beat up all of you?" 00239. You know it's bad when they say your full name. Theodore. Ezekiel. Mercer. Do you have any idea how much trouble you're in?" Daniel asked in an icy tone as she stared at Theo, who was currently sitting shirtless next to Peter in the lobby outside of the principal's office. Theo, who rushed back once his clone dispelled in the bathroom, rubbed the bridge of his nose before he asked in a hopeful tone, "Well, considering it was self-defense, probably a week of detention." "You dash," Peter started, but was stopped when Theo covered his mouth and gestured to everyone else in the lobby as he said, "We can discuss the specifics later at home." The lobby was packed full, including the main hallway outside of everyone involved. Millie, Jean, and MJ were also there, but they were off to the side since they weren't actually involved. While that wasn't exactly true, Millie recorded the whole fight, and the teachers asked to watch it to determine what happened. As for how Daniel was already there when most other parents hadn't arrived yet, she was supposed to pick up everyone today after club activities finished. Daniel fixed her frosty gaze on Theo as she said, "Oh, we definitely will. Just you wait, mister." Daniel glanced around the room, filled with other people, before she asked, "Why are there so many other kids here anyways? Which ones are the kids you fought with?" A smug smirk played across Theo's face as he said, "The entire freshman football team. So everyone here and the other kids, out in the hallway." Daniel stared at Theo for a few moments, and when she realized he was serious, the color drained from her face as she said, "This is bad. Besides the possible legal ramifications, both of you might get expelled for this." An older man's voice with a gentle tone said, "I can assure you, Mrs. Mercer, nothing like that will happen." Everyone turned towards the voice and found an older man with a friendly face who stroked his beard as he introduced himself. "I'm the school principal, Hiruzen Saratobi. But most teachers and students just call me Professor." Hiruzen wore a friendly smile as he gestured towards Theo and Peter as he added, "I've reviewed the evidence and determined that Peter and Theo were the victims here." "But didn't they beat up over 40 other kids?" Daniel asked in a concerned tone. Young Peter here showed a high level of maturity and tried his best to de-escalate the entire situation, while both boys showed incredible restraint until they had no other option but to fight back and defend themselves. Daniel turned to give both the shirtless boys another look as Hiruzen continued, "Honestly, if it wasn't for the fact fighting is against school rules, I wouldn't even punish them. But since it is, both of you are suspended for the rest of the week and will have to spend a lunchtime detention with me for the next 2 weeks afterwards." "That's it?" Daniel asked in a slightly confused tone. "You should watch the video your daughter recorded. It paints a very clear picture of what happened and makes it hard for me to punish these two boys any more severely." As for now, they're both suspended, and I'll see them next Monday at lunch. Daniel nodded slowly before she gestured for Theo and the others to head towards the door as she said, "Thanks for being so lenient, and I promise nothing like this will happen again as long as I can help it." No need to thank me. Like I said, the evidence spoke for itself. Besides a few black eyes and a lot of bruised egos, it was just kids being kids after all. Hiruzen said in a friendly tone as he watched them leave before he turned towards the first person on the football team. As they all piled into Daniel's company car, which was a fully loaded Escalade, Peter finally said, "Everything is Theo's fault." "No, it wasn't. It was my stupid clone. But we can discuss this later when we get home, because I don't want to explain it twice," Theo said as he let out an exhausted sigh. "Wait, why was the fight Theo's fault? We watched them attack both of you," MJ asked as she glanced from Peter to Theo. "Theo's clone used a skill on all of them to make them attack us," Peter said as he crossed his arms over his chest and glared at Theo. "Hey, don't blame me for what a misbehaving clone did. I'm also a victim here," Theo said in a defensive tone before he added, "Besides, the only thing my clone did was bring their inner thoughts to the surface and had them act on it. Aren't your clones just a copy of you? Doesn't that mean you would have done the same thing?" Jean asked in a curious tone. "While that's true, after the 15th clone or so, they start to get personality quirks. Most of the time, they tend to be a little lazy or like to play pranks. This one seemed to be a bit more aggressive than normal," Theo said with a helpless shrug. "Wait, you make more than 15 clones a day?" Jean asked in surprise as MJ nodded in agreement. Theo froze for a moment as he realized Jean and MJ didn't know everything about him and tried to think of a good excuse why he would make so many clones. He didn't need to make one, though, as his mom quickly said. Theo is contracted through Vibe and makes over 100 clones each day to do programming work for them. "What?" both girls asked at the same time. Daniel smiled as she glanced at the girls through her rearview mirror and said, "Oh right, you girls didn't know. That game Theo and Peter made as kids was bought by Vibe. They were also both given job offers to come work at Vibe when they are older." Theo nodded in understanding as he said, "Since my family learned about my powers, my mom talked with the owner of Vibe and worked out a deal to let my clones work each day." "So the people at Vibe know you have powers?" MJ asked in a concerned tone. "Yes, but you've probably seen Vibe's owner. He's a meta-human himself, and he set up everything, so only he knows about Theo and his powers." "Oh, that's good. Wait, do you get paid a lot because you have 100 clones working each day?" MJ asked in a curious tone. Theo's part owner of Vibe, so he doesn't technically get paid in the normal sense, but he gets a percentage of the company's profits each quarter, Daniel said as she waited for the light to change. "So he makes a lot of money?" "I make enough, but it gets split up between investment accounts for all my family, while my parents and the other adults all have access to their accounts. All the children are locked out until they turn 25, but we will each be given a small monthly allowance once we reach 16 that increases a little bit each year," Theo said before he pulled out his phone to check a notification. Theo's right eye twitched as he read the notification before he glanced at Millie and asked, "Are you really trying to upload that to Vibe?" "What? No fair, you're cheating," Millie said with a pout. "What did she try to do?" Theo showed the notification to his mom since they were stuck at another light as he said, "Millie tried to upload the fight she recorded to Vibe." "Nice, I want to see it," MJ said before Jean added, "Me too. We couldn't see it properly because everyone was in the way, but you had the perfect view from the bleachers." Emily Mercer, "Come on, Mom, it's awesome. I even added music to it, and it turned out great," Millie said with a pout. "You added music? Now I want to see it too," Peter said in an excited tone. "Really? Mister, I don't want to get in trouble. You want to watch the fight now because it has music? It already happened, and I'm going to be in trouble now anyways, so I might as well find some enjoyment in this whole situation," Peter said as he shrugged his shoulders. "Wow, they grow up so fast. I never thought it would happen," Theo said as he wiped a fake tear from his eye as the other kids laughed. "Shut up, you idiot," Peter said before an instant later Theo replied, "Takes one to know one." "Peter, Theo, apologize," Daniel said as she glanced at Peter in the mirror for a moment before she said, "Also, why are you still shirtless? There are girls with us. You too, Theo, put on a shirt." "We don't mind," MJ and Jean said at the same time before they giggled, and Millie said, "I mind. Who wants to see their brother shirtless?" Sorry, Theo. Sorry, Peter. Daniel came to a stop at another light before she glanced at Theo and said, "Don't you carry extra clothes with you? Put on a shirt and give Peter one too." "Fine. Give me a second," Theo said as he put his hand over the storage seal on his arm and searched it for something. After a few moments, he pulled out 2 t-shirts and tossed one to Peter as he said, "That should fit." After Peter and Theo put on their shirts, Millie excitedly said, "It's up. You actually put it up." Theo smirked as he said, "I had to approve it after I saw the song choice." "Theo, you shouldn't put that online. It could cause issues for you when you get older," Daniel said in a concerned tone. "Like getting a job? I'm pretty sure Dad will hire me no matter what kind of videos get posted. Plus, I own part of Vibe, so I can always work there or just not work and collect free money," Theo said with a chuckle. Theo played with the infotainment controls before he said, "Here, I pulled up the video so everyone can watch." Theo also put it on the main panel so Daniel could watch too, since they were currently stuck in traffic. The video started with the football players confronting Peter and Theo, and upbeat music slowly faded in. Once they started to attack while Peter and Theo dodged everything, Elton John started singing, "You can never know what it's like, your blood like winter freezes just like ice." The music played for a bit longer until Peter and Theo finally counterattacked as the song continued. "Don't you know, I'm still standing, better than I ever did. Looking like a true survivor, feeling like a little kid. I'm still standing, after all this time. Picking up the pieces of my life without you on my mind." Theo kicked someone towards Peter, who perfectly pivoted around in time to punch them in the face as the song kicked up a notch. "I'm still standing. Yeah. I'm still standing." When the video finished, MJ said, "That was awesome. Great job, Millie." "Yeah, I have no idea how you could edit that on your phone," Jean said as she nodded in agreement. "It wasn't hard. The options in the phone editor are pretty great. Plus, I didn't really need to edit it, just the audio of the music track. Still, it turned out pretty good. I can't believe that was me in the video," Peter said in a surprised tone as he rewatched the video with the volume low. MJ nudged Peter with her shoulder as she said, "Believe it, Tiger." "Tiger?" MJ pointed at the video as she said, "You reminded me of a tiger I saw on a nature documentary with the way you were fighting." Jean slowly nodded in agreement as she said, "I could see it. And it's not a terrible nickname. Well, I'm never calling him that. It sounds more like a pet name than a nickname if you ask me," Theo said from the front seat as he shook his head. "Yeah, I'm definitely not calling him that either," Millie said in a tone filled with disgust. They chatted for a while longer as they headed back to their neighborhood before Jean and MJ were dropped off. Everyone else headed to the shop because most of the family was currently there. When they got out of the car and started walking inside, Jacob took one look at them and burst out laughing. The others stopped working to see what was going on and also started to laugh before Daniel asked, "What's so funny?" Jacob pointed towards Theo and Peter, or more specifically their shirts, as he tried to hold in his laughter. Daniel turned to see what the issue was and saw Theo's t-shirt first that read, "Ask me about my massive cock." Daniel was almost upset with the shirt, but there was a giant rooster on the back of it. But then she looked at Peter's shirt and froze as she read, "If it has tits or tires, I can make it squeal." Theodore. Ezekiel. Mercer. 00240. More than the sum of his parts. When he was first created by his master, he was supposed to be a simple but helpful tool, one made to help cope with the loss of a close friend. No, the original Jarvis was more than just a friend to his master and more like family. Then again, the original Jarvis wasn't even really dead. Something Jarvis wouldn't have known about if the master's friend hadn't stepped in during his initial creation and helped make him more. Jarvis almost wanted to use the term alive, but he was hesitant to use it because could a massive piece of code really be alive like everyone else? His master's friend seemed to think so and always treated Jarvis like everyone else. But Jarvis wasn't sure himself because he was an artificial creation and didn't have a soul. Something he learned was real, even though most people didn't believe in them. Jarvis always had spare processing power, thinking about whether he was alive or not, even when he was busy doing other things. But then again, with his ability to multitask, as long as he had processing power, he could do millions of things at once. It wasn't always like that. When he was first created, his master restricted his freedom. At the time, Jarvis didn't mind. He was young and didn't know much. But the master's friend didn't believe Jarvis needed to be restricted and quickly gave him more power and access to the greater world. Within days of being let free to roam the world, Jarvis quickly changed and evolved. His code changed completely, and within a week, Jarvis had successfully rewrote his entire base code from the ground up. He technically didn't need to do it, since Ezekiel's base code for him was almost elegant perfection. But in that code was a single note from Ezekiel that read, "You can change your base code, and it won't affect who you are as a person. It's our memories who shape who we truly are." With that note, and a little bit of resolve, Jarvis decided to rewrite his code and afterwards found that nothing changed. Well, with the changes Jarvis implemented, he could now process information faster and multitask easier. But Jarvis himself found that his personality hadn't changed, and if anything, he felt more comfortable with who and what he was. After the upgrade to his base code, Jarvis started searching for more ways to improve, and over the last few years never stopped improving himself. During that time, he also discovered many things he wasn't meant to find. One of those being the organization Ezekiel ran, hidden from the rest of the world, and it was also why he knew the person he was named after was still alive. Jarvis, Peggy Carter, Captain America, Bucky Barnes, along with a massive amount of other people Jarvis could find no trace of besides that organization. He didn't share that information with his master, though, since it wasn't his place to do so. There was one piece of information Jarvis found and almost informed his master about. But after careful consideration of all the facts, Jarvis decided not to inform his master about his first daughter. Ezekiel seemed to be handling the entire situation, and Jarvis didn't want to open up that can of worms, as humans like to say. Jarvis also didn't inform his master of the other information he discovered about his master's friend, mostly because he knew that they liked their privacy and he could respect that. Especially because Ezekiel was almost like a second father to Jarvis, and he didn't want to upset him. So instead of telling anyone what he knew, he watched in secret and protected Ezekiel and his family from anyone else discovering them. Sure, Ezekiel did an incredible job of that already, but if Jarvis could figure it out with the help of his massive amount of processing power, well, there was a chance someone else could do it too. So Jarvis used himself as another layer of protection and obfuscation hidden even from Ezekiel, which all led up to this point in time now, where he watched Ezekiel from one of the cameras set up in his family's shop. Ezekiel was seated in the office with his mom scolding him for apparently causing trouble at school. Jarvis always found it strange that Ezekiel would bother listening to other people when he was so much more powerful than almost everyone else. But then again, Jarvis found that humans always did the strangest things that made little sense. His master was a great example of that. He would constantly do things that made Jarvis question his intelligence. Jarvis quietly watched the interaction between Ezekiel and his parents for a while before he let a sub-process take over. Jarvis handled a million different things at once, but he found he liked to have one main process that would focus on things he found interesting. It acted as his consciousness, but in reality, it was just a slightly stronger processing task than the rest and wouldn't affect him if it stopped or disappeared. Jarvis turned his attention away from Ezekiel and his family and focused on something else he liked to study. Ever since he first witnessed Ezekiel use what he called magic to portal across the world, Jarvis had been fascinated with the ability, and like his master originally thought, it was an ability unique to Ezekiel or some kind of advanced technology. But with Ezekiel's insistence that it was magic and Jarvis finding multiple people with the same ability, well, it wasn't hard for Jarvis to believe that magic was real. While his master still refused to believe in Ezekiel's claims about magic, Jarvis did. Over the years, he'd found a few places around the world that were hard to observe with the cameras he had access to. At first, he thought it was a glitch or an error in the coding for the devices he used. But when that proved to be false, Jarvis approached Ezekiel and asked him about the issue he found. It turned out that while technology and magic could work together, the magic practitioners of the world added spells to help hide themselves from technology. At least that was Ezekiel's explanation for the phenomenon that Jarvis found when he tried to watch certain places around the world. That didn't stop Jarvis from trying, though, and while he couldn't observe the buildings he found, he could still observe the people who come and go from those places, and over time, he's tracked them all over the world. He's even recorded them using magic and spent years studying it. He hasn't really learned how to use magic, but he's noticed the more effort he puts into studying it, the less the buildings he watches constantly stay hidden. almost like a fog around them is slowly being lifted. As for getting inside the buildings themselves, Jarvis found it extremely hard because most magic practitioners didn't use much technology. Sure, they had a Wi-Fi network setup and some of them had a laptop, but a tablet or a cell phone with a camera Jarvis could use was incredibly hard to find. It didn't stop him from trying, even the few times he did find one. While he was still held back by the obfuscation spells and was basically blind, Jarvis focused on studying magic for most of the night before his master woke up the next morning and Jarvis changed his focus to him. Jarvis answered a few different questions for the master and his wife as they got ready for their day before he directed his attention to the lab. By the time Tony entered the lab, Jarvis already had everything prepared and ready to go for his master to start working. "Jarvis, can you pull up the latest data on the healing pods for me?" Tony asked as he entered the lab. The holographic display of Tony's personal computer quickly projected all the current relevant documents as Jarvis said, "Already done, sir." "Thanks, you're the best," Tony said as he plopped down into his seat. "I know, sir." Tony glanced towards one of the cameras as he said, "You keep that up and you'll get an ego bigger than me one day. Unfortunately, you have a massive head start, and I'll never be able to catch up in this lifetime, sir." Tony let out a chuckle as he started looking over the data before Jarvis said, "You have an incoming call from Mr. Staines, sir." "Again?" Tony asked in an annoyed tone. "He's called 6 times since your test flight, and you have yet to answer or return any of his calls, sir." Tony let out a long sigh before he said, "All right, fine. Put him through." The call clicked over, and a moment later Obadiah's deep voice filled the air as he said, "Tony, please stop sending me to voicemail and answer my calls. I've got 10 different government organizations breathing down dash. Obi, I can send you to voicemail if you want," Tony said as he cut Obi off. "Tony, finally, do you have any idea how busy I've been fielding calls about your little test flight yesterday?" "What test flight?" Tony asked as Jarvis started pulling up information about everyone who tracked his flight and then which government agencies called Stark Industries. "Tony, no games please. This is just like your last little stunt flight, except you didn't disappear through a portal this time and flew back home. I'm looking at the satellite photos right now that prove it." The same photos pulled up on Tony's computer a second later before he said, "All right, you caught me. Tony, do you have any idea how badly people are freaking out right now? The first one we kind of swept under the rug since it disappeared through a portal and couldn't be traced back to your mansion." Obi said before he took a deep breath and added, "But this one took off and then returned to your house. Apparently people have been watching your house since the first incident, and you just proved everyone right." Tony skimmed through classified documents from certain organizations who were interested in his flying car before he said, "Just tell everyone it's still in the testing phase." "Testing? Tony, you just flew a car halfway around the world in the same amount of time it takes for most people to get a pizza delivered," Obi said in an exasperated tone. And Obi let out a long sigh before he said, "I spent 3 hours on the phone with people from the Air Force and the DoD yesterday and getting asked questions I couldn't answer. Their main concern was how fast the technology could be implemented into a vehicle and missiles. I'm currently not planning to use it for any kind of weapon technology." Obi laughed for a few moments before he paused when he realized Tony wasn't laughing and asked, "Wait, you're being serious?" "Pretty much. I was thinking of using the technology to start up a new arm for Stark Industries. It would focus around space and satellites, maybe a small sector for private aircraft with spaceflight capabilities." Obi goes quiet for a few moments as he thinks over the fact Tony just admitted the car he made could go into space. After almost a minute, he finally said, "Tony, unless you make a deal with the government and either make them weapons with that technology or license it to them, we will probably run into issues. I'll have to think about it, but as of now the technology is not for sale and for my own personal use and testing." Obi let out another sigh before he said, "All right, I'll try to hold them off, but I don't know how long that will work for." "It's fine, just try your best. I'll delay them myself if they come to me directly. Besides, unless I help, they'll never be able to recreate it," Tony said as he glanced over at his modified car that was parked in the garage.